Good morning, everybody. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. My name is Michael Nesper. I work at the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, FRA. Many thanks to ERA for inviting us again this year, and many thanks to you for showing interest in having fundamental rights or human rights in the context of counterterrorism covered in a bit more detail this year. I will have the pleasure to speak about that topic, but I will actually focus more on the practical side of things rather than on the legal side, which will be to a large extent covered by Anna afterwards, who will be talking about the ECHR jurisprudence and standards. Looking at the topics which are on the list for this conference, of course, a very broad list encompassing a number of EU policies, EU measures, each with their own fundamental rights implications. So this presentation will not have the ambition to cover all of them, not at all, but rather use some examples building on some of the research and findings of our agency. And I will focus not so much on safeguards and on remedies against possible violations of fundamental human rights during the implementation of security measures, but rather on the benefit of integrating the fundamental rights perspective in the design of counterterrorism and other security measures, showing that the need to safeguard fundamental rights and the goal of effectiveness of law enforcement actually more often than not go hand in hand, should go hand in hand, can go hand in hand. Okay, I'll jump back and forth a bit. Of course, the idea that human rights and security should be working together or should be seen as two sides of the same coin, etc., that's nothing new. Already in the 2006 UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy was emphasized that effective counterterrorism measures and the protection of human rights are complementary and mutually reinforcing goals rather than conflicting ones. Now, this underlying logic has two elements. First of all, on the one hand, that terrorism, of course, negatively affects the environment in which we live, and therefore, obviously, also decreases or complicates the opportunity to safeguard fundamental rights and for fundamental rights to flourish. That is the one side of it. But there's the other side of it as well, that violent extremism and terrorism does not arise in a vacuum, and that actual or perceived injustice of discrimination or feeling of discrimination, for example, or marginalization, can make some narratives more attractive in the eyes of certain individuals and make them more vulnerable, for example, to radicalization. Now, this is a bigger chunk of text saying similar things in a bit more detail. These are the Council conclusions from 2016 on the prevention of radicalization leading to violent extremism. And these take a comprehensive approach towards radicalization, a comprehensive approach to violent extremism, and acknowledging that there is a complex scale of factors, let's put it this way, that may play a role in this regard. It also reflects quite well what is indicated by research. That is that there are individual pathways to becoming a terrorist, that these pathways vary, that there are different factors for every individual who becomes radicalized, and it underlines the need for research in this regard. It underlines the need to understand better these factors. And among other actors who could be involved in that, it also, by the way, mentions the role for the Fundamental Rights Agency. Now, I will go back again 2 slides. Now, this is a map, as you can see, which I stole from a colleague who can speak for hours about the FRA mandate and what we do on issues like this, and how we interact with the other dots, which are actually the other EU agencies. Well, I will spare you that, of course. Just enough to say that FRA is an EU agency tasked with providing what is called, in our mandate, evidence-based advice on compliance with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights to EU institutions and EU member states. We do that in a number of ways, and this is just a snapshot showing that the evidence-based actually means that data collection is one of the agency's working instruments. So we issue comparative studies on a number of topics, from discrimination to data protection, to the rights of victims of crime, but we also feed directly into the legislative process at the EU level, as well as more indirectly cooperating with EU institutions when requested. Now, giving you a snapshot of the type of outputs that the agency produces that are to some extent relevant to the issue of security, including addressing the threat of terrorism, I think it's quite useful for us to set the stage or set the scene a little bit for this presentation. Basically, this is just a list, but it shows that some of the research that we do focuses quite directly on policies that fall squarely into the security area. For example, our reports on surveillance by national intelligence authorities, which look at the challenges for individuals in accessing remedies in relation to surveillance and the importance of independent oversight mechanisms. Or, for example, looking in a different area at the issue of interoperability, of the use of or the collection of biometric data for EU databases. But then again, there is other FRA research, which provides data on phenomena which, let's say, have a broader social impact. For example, discrimination, social exclusion of certain groups. But as our research shows, the findings can be actually quite relevant when discussing issues such as radicalization to violence. Now, this is a bit of a mess, I admit. But based on the agency's recent research, I picked two examples to demonstrate that paying due attention to fundamental rights impact actually helps reinforce also the effectiveness of security measures, including measures aimed at combating terrorism. I mean, this slide is confusing for a good reason. It's on purpose. It tries to give an overview of the European information systems and information exchange mechanisms in the area of justice and home affairs. And it actually serves to introduce the first example that I would like to touch upon, which is security and migration. Now, the complex landscape of the databases illustrates the overlapping of the two challenges that the EU is currently facing, as well as the member states, of course. That is managing migration, at the same time responding to the threat of terrorism. Migration is, of course, inherently linked to some of the organized crime activities, such as trafficking in human beings, such as migrant smuggling. And the fact that unregulated migration movements may be also an opportunity for dangerous individuals to enter Europe is well recognized. And also from the fundamental rights perspective, there is no argument to raise against that, since this is simply a matter of fact. But there are two issues that I would like to mention in this regard. First of all, the increasingly fluid approach to the collection and use of migration-related data, also for law enforcement purposes, and the broader impact of the joined-up migration and security discourse. First of all, obviously, modern law enforcement relies increasingly on data to do its work properly, and you know that better than anyone else. Both in migration and law enforcement, there is a perceived information gap, and therefore a move towards upgrading both the existing databases, such as Eurodac, such as the SIS, as well as the creation of new databases, such as the entry-exit system or ETS. And there's also an increasing tendency to use migration-related information, not only for migration management purposes, but also for combating terrorism and serious crime. This is something that was the case already in the past, such as by adding the law enforcement purpose to VIS, to Eurodac. But now some of the new tools are proposed directly with the twin purpose of addressing both migration and law enforcement needs. The ETS, the European Travel Authorization System, being a good example of that. Now, this, of course, may be fully legitimate, but also raises new questions that need to be addressed. For example, how to ensure strict purpose limitation, that is, who has access to what data, for what purpose, at which stage. It also brings additional issues when it is linked up with the other big debate that takes place, of course, at the EU level. And that is the question of making the databases interoperable. So that, for example, in a single search, you would get a more complete set of information on a person by consulting multiple databases at a time. FRA was involved in the work of the high-level expert group on interoperability, organized by the Commission. And there we looked at both the challenges but also opportunities that are posed by the linking of the databases. And indeed, there are potential benefits. There's actually a good example of how security measures, so measures that are primarily focusing at improving the effectiveness of migration management, law enforcement, how they also have potential positive fundamental right side effects. In this case, for example, better interoperability of the databases will make it easier to search for missing children and detect them when they are passing through the EU to Europe. But one of the key concerns, and there are several of those, but I'll mention just one, is the quality of the data. And our research among border guards, consular officers, and other professionals actually confirms that some databases, such as SIS, such as Eurodac, do not always contain accurate data. It's often the case of alphanumeric data, where there are often mistakes in names due to obvious reasons, such as transliteration, such as similarities of names in certain language groups, but also simply processing errors or errors on the input side, so simply quick entry of data, which can lead to mistakes. But also there could be mistakes in links between alphanumeric and biometric data, so the link between the fingerprint entered in a system and the name attached to it. Again, often something that could happen during situations where the data is collected and entered into the systems rather quickly, which was exactly the case, of course, during the last 2 years, especially in the southern EU frontline member states. Now, the nature of the databases makes it quite difficult for the person, even if the person knows about it, to actually rebut the assumption that the data in the database is correct. And this already poses a problem now, and if this is not addressed, then moving on to the next stage, which is interoperability of the databases, of course can actually multiply this problem and lead to creating wrong links between profiles. Now, why am I talking about all of this? What I explained here now looks at the first sight as a fundamental rights-related issue. It is an argument to double-check, triple-check the data, to maybe collect less data, to collect different sorts of data, and so on. It's not quite as simple as that. Of course, inaccurate data may impact on a number of people's freedoms and rights. It could be a matter of refusal of entry. It could be a matter of complicating the asylum procedure. It could also, however, be a matter of ending up targeted by law enforcement because your data actually connects with the wrong profile. But at the same time, it is also a matter of law enforcement and counter-terrorism effectiveness. Let's not forget that law enforcement access to these databases is mostly for the purpose of combating terrorism and serious crime and other serious crime. So when law enforcement does access databases such as Eurodac, then there's a very good reason for it. And this also means that these are not cases where resources, time, etc. could be wasted. Quality of the data in these databases is, of course, of utmost importance because you do not want to follow the wrong lead, and not just that you don't want to bring a person who should not be in trouble into trouble. You actually want to catch the right person as quickly as possible. So this shows that fundamental rights and law enforcement interests often go hand in hand, such as in this case. And secondly, the broader issue referred to in that quote by Commissioner King. So the risk of conflating the terrorism threat and the migration challenge. That there is, of course, the interest in identifying persons entering the EU, particularly those coming with the large-scale influx of the last 2 years. That is fully legitimate. And obviously it's needed in order to protect not just the EU borders, but also to protect EU security, in order to identify individuals who already are or might become radicalized. But what this quote shows very clearly, and this is why I used it, is that there is actually a strong awareness also at the EU level that the need to detect potential threats, which is posed by individuals, needs to avoid the stigmatization of the entire groups. Now, the end of it is quite interesting. If you conflate the separate challenges, you do the work of ISIS for them. Not only that, not only you potentially make the work of the recruiters easier, not only you potentially create an environment which is more potent for radicalization, But you also play into the hands of those people who probably, for most governments, should not be involved in the decision-making in the future, such as extremist political forces at the national level. And finally, it also severely impacts on the ability of those who might in the future, for example, be recognized as refugees and will stay in Europe, at least for some time, to integrate into societies. So again, we're back with the issue of people being more easily exploited by, for example, radical recruiters. Now, this brings us back to the language of the Council conclusions on radicalization, which named a number of factors that might play a role, such as access to education, marginalization, and so on and so forth. So what we get to hear quite often in the discourse today is that reception centers for asylum seekers are a place potentially targeted by extremist recruiters, which might well be true. A lot is being said about the vulnerability of children or young migrants to radicalization. This also means that sustainable solutions will be quite difficult to find without addressing issues such as conditions in the centers, integration prospects for new arrivals, or meaningful access to education for children. Now, looking further into the question of what I called in the title of the presentation as a rights-based approach to security, there is one specific set of findings that the agency is working on, has produced partly already now, recently, that illustrates this need quite clearly. And in a couple of weeks, FRA will issue the second European Union Minorities and Discrimination Survey. That's a large-scale survey that collected data on immigrants and ethnic minorities, discrimination and victimization experiences. In all 28 member states, there are some 25,500 people covered by that. This is still to come out over the next 2 weeks, but over 10,500 of these people self-identified themselves as Muslims. And a comparative analysis of their experience in some 15 member states has already been published in September. And it looks at first and second generation Muslims, so immigrants or their children born in the EU, so not recent arrivals, but people who have actually been living in the EU for some time. And it is basically, to put it simply, the largest ever collection of data on the experiences of this specific community with discrimination, but also on their approach to issues such as trust in the authorities, including the police, or sense of belonging to the country where they live. Perhaps it's good to mention that roughly half of these people are actually citizens of the member states that they live in. Now, the results of this survey paint quite an interesting picture of the subjective experience of Muslims with discrimination and violence, but also, as I said, their own sense of belonging. As you can see on the screen, 81% and 76% of that feel strongly. So 81% feel attached and 76% feel strongly attached to the country of their residence. They have higher levels of trust in public authorities than the average population. And this particularly, which I think is quite an interesting finding, particularly to the police and the legal system. Then it goes down to the parliament, political parties, and so on and so forth. But the police is by far the most trusted authority among Muslim migrants in the EU. Now, at the same time, the results also show that 39% of the respondents felt discriminated because of their ethnic or immigrant background in daily life, so at work, at school, when interacting with the authorities, over the last 5 years, and some 25% just in the last year. And when looked specifically about why they believe they were discriminated against, what they thought was the strongest factor, we see that in comparison with the first round of the survey in 2008-2009, there's actually a rise in the factor of religion. They increasingly believe that they are being discriminated for their religion. I have to say, this is a matter of subjective interpretation. This is a matter of their subjective feeling of being discriminated and why they have been discriminated. But I'll get back to that in a short while. Another interesting indicator is the harassment in public. It shows that this experience is higher among women, and not surprisingly, those who wear religious clothing. But at the same time, it also shows that the level of reporting of these experiences is very low. Only some 9% of women who claim to have been harassed among the Muslim population, who claim to have been harassed in the last 5 years, actually went and reported that either to the police or to anyone else. And about half of them say that they have not done so because they felt that nothing would change. Also an interesting comparison with our research on reporting to the authorities of victims of various forms of crime. When we ran a large-scale survey a few years ago on violence against women, and we asked whether the victims who reported to the police were actually satisfied with the way their case was handled by the police. And 66% of the women who reported said, yes, we're satisfied with the way that our complaint was handled. In case of the Muslim woman, this was 13%. I will move on to the next slide, which shows you the level of trust, which I mentioned before, level of trust in the police. And there is one thing to add to that. First of all, you can see that the figures are very different. This is just a scale from 1 to 10. From 0 to 10, 0 meaning not at all, and 10 meaning yes, to a large extent, fully. So you can see that there are quite large differences in not only the various member states, but also in the various groups of Muslims, because we looked at several groups based on their region of origin. So you have North Africans, you have Sub-Saharan Africans, there are people of Turkish origin, and people from South Asia primarily. And then there are some smaller categories for some member states. But what is quite interesting is to see that even when one considers these differences between the different groups looked at in different member states, you still have quite a disparity between the level of trust in the police of Turkish immigrants in Germany and in the Netherlands, for example, or Sub-Saharan Africans in Italy and in Finland. Sure, it has its reasons. For example, in case of Italy, one of the clear reasons is that Italy being one of the frontline member states, of course, in the migration flows, there are more checks also by the police on people of foreign appearance and potentially migrant origin. But still, the differences are quite significant. What is quite important in this regard, and this is a nice conclusion to this slide, is that while there is a strong sense of attachment and trust in the authorities among the people, and there is a certain level of discrimination which can be described as quite high, at least from the subjective experiences, there is some correlation. Those who felt discriminated or encountered harassment or violence show significantly lower levels of trust in the police and in the legal system, and they have low levels of attachment to the country of residence. The difference is 81 as opposed to 68%. So there is a correlation. Now, bringing this to a more operational level, there's perhaps no need to say that police-community relations are indeed an important asset in addressing a number of issues, including radicalization to violence, and potentially also dealing with emerging security threats. Now, 29% of Muslim respondents of the survey, which I just presented, have been stopped by the police over the last 5 years, and some 16%, so more than a half of those, actually experienced this in the course of the last year. So it would seem from the subjective memories of these people that most of the stops of the last 5 years actually took place over the last year. Not necessarily entirely correct, for a reason I'll explain. In a similar way, 42% of respondents who were stopped by the police in the last year believe that this was because of their ethnic or immigrant background, compared to 32% over the 5 years. So there's the feeling we're being stopped more recently, and it's more often for discriminatory reasons, if you put it this way. Of course, this is one of the pitfalls of the subjective experience. Matter of memory, the matter of how you interpret past events as opposed to more recent events. But still, it may also reflect changing practices in police stops, possibly related to the increased focus on security in the EU member states. Now, the sense of discrimination, so the sense that they are being stopped purely because they look the way they look, because they belong to a certain ethnicity, is much higher among some groups of Muslims, especially North and Sub-Saharan Africans, compared to, for example, people coming from Turkey. They are also significantly higher for men, particularly young men, not surprisingly, and further, much higher among men who sometimes or always wear religious clothing, or clothing based on which their religion can be identified. Again, this does not necessarily give any evidence of discriminatory profiling, but it shows that a considerable share of Muslim respondents, so Muslims in the EU, feel that such profiling is taking place. So the question is whether this is something that should not be taken into account, regardless whether this is an objective or simply a subjective feeling. And the report also contains specific recommendations in this regard on how to address this issue and counter the loss of trust, for example, through training or increased focus on community policing. I think I'm slowly running out of time, is that so? I'll take 5 more minutes, if I may. Thank you. Now, what this points to is the broader issue that is often highlighted in relation to not only counter-terrorism, but security measures in general. And that is the impact of measures that are, or again, are perceived as being of blanket nature, of targeting an entire group rather than specific individuals. Basically creating the impression that the whole group is suspicious for some reason. Now, the effects of such measures can be looked at from both fundamental rights and law enforcement perspective. One of the issues, of course, is the effect on social cohesion. The negative effect if an entire group feels that it is being singled out for no reason. This is something that is emphasized in the European Agenda on Security, so the Commission leading document in this regard, which says that the EU response to extremism must not lead to the stigmatization of any one group or community. It must draw on common European values of tolerance, diversity, and mutual respect, and promote free and pluralist communities. But when it drops down to the individual level, then, of course, there's also an issue which should be discussed in terms of the feeling of marginalization and being treated unfairly. And the fact that by research, and now not referring so much to FRA research, but to specialist bodies which actually look at counter-terrorism measures more specifically. So the feeling of marginalization and the notion of us versus them is very often referred to as one of the key tools of the ISIS recruitment strategy. In a way, a starting point in this regard. Now, the third point is perhaps even more law enforcement oriented, and that is the fact that if the measures are not targeted in a way that is perceived as appropriate, the authorities may lose the trust and cooperation of those people who are actually most valuable in detecting and preventing threats. And you know that better than anyone else, that people such as teachers, religious leaders, family members can often be the ones providing the leads and helping to detect potential threats. And those who can first detect radicalization when it is occurring. Of course, their willingness to report or testify might be lower in case that the whole community seems to be targeted by specific measures. Now, this approach also risks to lose those who try to create a healthy environment in the society itself or in the community itself. By this, what I mean is that, for example, moderate religious leaders preaching for mutual respect and against violence might obviously be undermined in their efforts if there is a general perception in the community that it is being unjustly targeted and seen as a threat to the majority population. And the last remark I can make in this regard is, of course, the issue of the overall effectiveness of measures that are too blunt and predictable, and whose criteria can be easily avoided. Now, this is something that we know from border management, for example, where border checks which are clearly based on ethnicity, religion, appearance, can be bypassed much easier than those which are based on prior intelligence, behavior, and advanced risk assessment. A similar thing goes for police stops, but also for more advanced operational police work, where obviously those who do not fit the bill, such as Muslim converts, whose numbers are growing and who do not really fulfill the criterion of belonging to a certain ethnicity, for example, or certain migrant group, might be much harder to detect through these measures than others. I will leave it here. We have looked at, I've tried to look at some examples showing that security measures could actually benefit from integrating what might at the first look seem to be primarily fundamental rights considerations, particularly if they are supposed to be successful in the long term, sustainable, and contribute to the safety and security over a longer period than just the immediate action. Of course, EU legislation and policy documents we've seen underline that security and fundamental rights should be complementary, and that's a good thing that they underline that. But this presentation hopefully helped a bit to see that they also realistically can go hand in hand and can mutually support each other, and that a fundamental rights argument can also work in favor of effectiveness of law enforcement measures, and law enforcement measures can be designed in a way to also foster and support fundamental rights. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for having taken a bit longer, and I look forward to our discussion and your questions.